The Hindu tradition has a rich literary tradition, and this tradition begins with the Vedas. And in the Hindu tradition, the word Veda means knowledge, and there are four main collections of Vedas, and these are the sources of what develops into what we know today as the Hindu religious tradition. Now, the most problematic of the Vedas, the earliest Veda, the Rig Veda, is an action story. An action story which appears to support the idea of an invasion of somewhere. And that's why it's connected with the Aryan invasion theories. But there are other Vedas, and the other Vedas are connected or are the sources for what later become the Upanishads. The Upanishads are commentaries on the Vedas that see their inner meaning. The most problematic of the Vedas is the Atharva Veda, which consists of magical spells. And this is something which Westerners find very hard to reconcile with the Vedanta tradition. That is, the tradition of the Hindu religion as a highly philosophical religion. What's it doing with magical spells in one of its main religious texts? But this is what the religion was. And this is something which we have to see in many religious traditions, that there is a magical side to a lot of religions. And in the Hindu tradition, this is something which later Hindu writers overlook. But it's nevertheless there in the early texts. And the question of what it means is something which we still need to do a lot of thinking about and which needs a lot of explanation. For Hindus, the Vedas are a literature which is sacred. It's a revealed literature, and therefore it's authoritative. But what does the revelation mean within the Hindu tradition? Who's revealed it? Is it the gods? Or is it a revelation that comes out of human beings? Or is it out of the universe? Again, there are lots of different interpretations of the meaning of the Vedas and the meaning of revelation within the Hindu tradition. Closely related to the Vedas, but coming from a much later period of time, is the epic literature of the Hindu tradition. And this epic literature develops between about 500 BC and 500 AD. And the epics are the great epics of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And these tell stories that become the basis of the ethical system of most Hindus. Stories which are used to teach children how to act ethically. And this is a very important aspect of the epic tradition, that these are the narrative paradigms that shape the daily living of many ordinary Hindus. And these are stories that were placed into plays very early in Indian history. So from about the 8th or the 9th century AD, you had groups of actors touring India, putting on plays. And these plays told the stories of the great epics of the Hindu tradition. And this was where the devotional literature begins to develop, because it's not that people studied the epics in themselves, but rather they learnt them by heart. They learnt them as stories. And these stories inspired them not only in religious thinking, but also in their daily lives as to how they should live. And what has become today the central epic is an extract, a section from the Mahabharata, which is an immensely long poetic composition. But the Gita is the story of Krishna and Krishna's work and Krishna's teaching. It's the story of a civil war. And the lead figure in the civil war, the prince, talks to his charioteer. And in talking to his charioteer, he discusses the question of whether he can fight against his relatives and whether he can kill his cousins and what's the meaning of life. And it turns out at the end that the charioteer himself is in fact Krishna. And Krishna is telling him that it's a matter of seeing things not as a matter of a small battle or not as a matter of a big battle where people get killed, but rather in a cosmic setting, and that what one must do is one's duty. So this is the message of the Gita. Now, in addition to this, there are Hindu law codes, and the law codes are very important and also probably the earliest of much of this literature. The law codes were codes of how to live and how society is organized. And these law codes embody things like the caste system, the relationship of parents to children, relationships to property, all sorts of things. And in the later law code, known as the Institutes of Vishnu, one gets the teaching of not only the caste system, but also the practice of sati, that is, the sacrifice of widows. And this becomes an important part of the Hindu tradition right down to the 19th century. And it's in the 19th century that Hindu reformers like Raman Roy came along and said, no, this is not part of our original tradition. This is a corruption of the Hindu tradition. And within the Hindu tradition, there's always been an impetus for reform. There are numerous reform movements that appear within the Hindu tradition throughout its history, where people come along and say, well, what we've been doing in the past is wrong. What we should do is this. And particularly in the 19th century, it was a great age of Hindu reform and change. And this also lends itself to what became the evolutionary theory of Hindu religion, where sacrifice was seen as the original type of religion, but then it became philosophical and moved away from sacrifices to philosophical speculation about the nature of the universe. We also get things like the Yoga Sutras, which teach meditatory practices which date sometime between the 4th century BC and the 6th century AD. And if you think, well, why am I being so... If it dates, that's a long period of time, it's 1,000 years. The fact of the matter is we don't really know. And one's got to take into account here the climate of India. There are some climates in the world where parchments and papers and things preserve for thousands of years without any difficulty. India is a very moist and damp climate. Things rot very easily. And therefore, we lack the records to know exactly when these things were written. But we've got an idea, we've got a rough idea, and much work has got to be done on this. The study of the Hindu tradition is one that superficially appears to be straightforward. People say things began at a certain point of time and they continued. But when you get closer to the text, when you look at the issues, there's a lot of doubt about the exact dates of things. It's not a very clear tradition historically. Developing later, you get the literature of the Upanishads, and again, there's a question about when the Upanishads developed. The Upanishads are the teachings of gurus who gathered around themselves a small group of people to whom they taught the inner meaning of the Vedas. And in teaching the inner meaning of the Vedas, they taught about meditation and the nature of the universe, and they were highly philosophical. So the Upanishads are a different type of literature, and it's out of the Upanishadic tradition that one gets what today would be called Vedanta. And this is a highly philosophical view of the Hindu tradition. In this Hindu tradition, you get many gods, and the question of the meaning of the gods varies a great deal. At the top of the Hindu hierarchy of gods is something like a trinity of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. These are 3 gods, but Brahma also can involve or can be understood to mean a spiritual force that embraces the whole universe. You also get many lesser gods, but not lesser gods for the worshipper. They're important for the worshipper. And the most famous of the lesser gods is, of course, Krishna. Krishna is probably the most popular of all Hindu gods, and certainly the best known in the West, because of the Hare Krishna movement, which was a Hindu missionary movement that sought to bring the teachings of Krishna to the West. Another aspect of the Hindu tradition, which comes out of the law codes, which is very disputed, is the caste system. Caste is very real in India. Caste remains very real today in India. There are very few places in the world where, for Hindus, caste isn't something that people take into account. It's something which is under question in many great cities of India today, as people go into things like high tech and they meet people from other castes and they fall in love. This is something which traditional Hindus would not allow. It's also something which surprisingly vanished in South Africa. The Indian community in South Africa, unlike most Indian communities throughout the world, didn't retain its devotion to caste. And so people of different castes married freely, and there wasn't an attention upon who you are and what your family is or where they came from in the South African situation. So this forms a unique type of Hindu community, which shows that the Hindu community is capable of change and adaptation. And today the caste system is under pressure from educated Indians. And it's been under pressure in many ways since the Hindu reform movement of the early 19th century. The other thing is that one has to realize that there is a complex calendar of events in the Hindu tradition. And this calendar of events involves all sorts of celebrations. Hindus love to celebrate. Now, Christians sometimes have a problem with this. How can you celebrate something, or how can you enjoy your neighbour celebrating something if you're a Christian and they're celebrating something like Diwali, the Festival of Lights? And I think the answer here is that when we talk about things like Diwali, we've got to ask, what are they representing? Now, some Christians would say it's simply demonic and you can't touch it at all. But on the other hand, Diwali, which begins as a religious festival, has become very much a social festival. It's become something like Christmas. Most people who practice Christmas around the world aren't really devout Christians, but Christmas has come to represent peace and goodwill to all men, to all people. And so Christmas has spread even in places where the people aren't Christians. And Diwali in many ways is very similar. We get Hindus practicing Diwali in North America when it's a social festival. It's a festival where people will think about the good and truth and light. And there's nothing really particularly wrong with this if we look at what it represents. Now, it will represent different things to different people, and a lot of it depends upon how devout the worshipper is. But for many Hindus, for the people who are likely to be your neighbours if they're Hindu, it's going to be a social festival when they give presents to people and when they celebrate light and goodness. And this is what we must remember when we approach these festivals of different religions. What do they really represent, and what do they represent to the people who are practicing them? Many people in the Hindu tradition, just like people in the Christian tradition, are really nominal in their beliefs. So they practice the celebrations, but they don't really go very deeply into the religious roots and the meaning of these celebrations. And this is something we need to bear in mind. There's also practices within the Hindu tradition that are very important to all Hindus that involve things like the birth of children, the coming of age of children, marriage. Now, these are all things that Christians can share. We can recognize something good in this. The Hindu tradition emphasizes the importance of the family and the keeping together of the family, the bond of the family, the relationship of younger people to older people. These are all valuable traditions that are human traditions. And they're things where people have special meals and special foods. And practically in a multicultural society, I think as Christians, we need to recognize that these are things that we can share with our Hindu neighbours. If they invite you to a meal, I don't think there's any real reason why one can't go. St. Paul is very careful about this. If you read St. Paul, he tells the Corinthians that they mustn't eat food which is sacrificed to idols, but they must remember that the idols don't mean anything. The idols are dead. And therefore, if it's a matter of human communion and eating food, there's nothing wrong with it. If you're asked to participate in some sort of ritual, that's different. So we've got to separate celebration from religious belief. And this, I think, becomes really true in terms of what neighbours are likely to do. Hindu worship has changed over time, and particularly in the West, Hindu temples have changed considerably. Many of them still contain images of the gods. But one must remember that these images of the gods are representations of the gods. Hindus don't believe that the image is actually the god. They believe that at times gods indwell the images through particular ceremonies. But then the gods leave the images. So you have the image of the god. But in the modern Hindu temples, many of them are just like churches. They have rows of seats. People come, they sit, they hear something like a sermon, they sing religious songs, and then they go home. They don't sacrifice to the gods in the temples very much. And if they sacrifice, what they sacrifice would be vegetarian type sacrifices or pouring milk over the gods, not sacrificing a chicken. So things have changed, and one's got to be constantly aware of these changes. The Hindu tradition is a very adaptive religious tradition. As a result, you're getting emerging in the West various forms of westernized Hinduism. And this begins in the 19th century with people like Raman Roy and also Radha Krishna, and it's developed into a missionary movement to Westerners. So while in the past Christians sent missionaries to India, today Indians are sending missionaries to North America to draw people back to God as they see it. So we've got to be sensitive to these changes and the Hindu migrations into the West. If you've got a Hindu neighbour, one needs to try to understand what they believe and exactly how they believe things, because the belief of many Hindus has changed over time. And many of them have a philosophical belief, they believe in a God, they have a good feeling towards Christianity. If you go into many Hindu temples, you'll see statues of Mary, statues of Jesus. And on the one hand, we can say, well, that's not truly Christianity. But on the other hand, I think we've got to recognize that these are people who are not hostile towards Christianity. Now, there are branches of the Hindu tradition that are hostile, but when people aren't hostile, there is a space here, a space for Christians to talk and to begin by asking, well, why is Jesus there? What do you think of Jesus? This is a place where people can begin to establish a human relationship with Hindus. And the human relationship is more important than anything else. It's the human relationship that leads people to Christ. And that's where we begin when we think about another religious tradition. How can we communicate the gospel to people? And we do that by, first of all, knowing where they're coming from. And this is a complex tradition. It's a difficult tradition to understand. And even people within the tradition don't always understand it. But we've got to make an effort to try to understand it and to see where our neighbours are coming from.